I, for one, feel very comfortable behind a bar speaking. I've been told that the best way to start a conversation is to pander to my audience. So the first thing that I want to talk about is, yes, my company name is NOBL. We taken from Alfred Nobel, and I think it demonstrates my perspective on time. Time is clearly the most scarce resource we have. I've spent half of my career in product innovation and service design, and half of my career in management consulting. And the question that I kept returning to, especially in my country, is if your work life is the majority of your life more and more, and our efforts at our jobs now are much more knowledge-based. We don't see the impact immediately of our work. Why do we come to work? What's the meaning of our work? And how will we reflect on our legacy afterwards? And what will we leave behind? So it's a very meaty beginning to our company. And what makes it worse is your first job when you're hired at our company is that you have to write your own obituary. So just throwing that out there, give it a shot. It's kind of tense. Aside from my personal perspective on time, we tend to work with two clients. We call them rocket ships and Goliaths. Goliaths are the companies that scale is no longer a competitive advantage, and they really find their own complexity to be slowing them down. And doing everything that was already spoken about today, I think the literacy of these ideas is becoming more and more spread, but the companies feel more enabled to actually go execute. And then our second type of clients are rocket ships, and they're the ones with huge exponential growth fostered by product market fit, and really it feels like the company's shaking apart and they're just trying to keep things together. And I think the last month has been terrible for rocket ship companies. If you look at Zirtual in the US, is a virtual assistant company. They had 400 employees. They fired one morning without any notice because it just turns out they weren't even tracking their business model. You have Quirky in the US, which was meant to revolutionize American manufacturing. They had a huge, I think, 500,000 member network that was inventing products with them. They just announced bankruptcy. So I think time is really the unifying factor between both giant companies and these crazy upstarts that we love to lionize, that we love to romance. But really, at the end of the day, the question that we're always trying to figure out, and I think the question a lot of people in this room might be trying to answer, is how do we design fast, effective teams? Not just fast, right? Like, you don't want a fast surgeon, for example. You want a fast, maybe effective first. Let's start there. So they remove the right leg. And if we were to ask this question to sort of the father of my own industry, management consulting, Frederick Taylor, in 1911, he would say something like this. One of the very first requirements for a man who is fit to handle pig iron as a regular occupation is that he shall be so stupid and so phlegmatic that he more nearly resembles in his mental makeup the ox other than any type. Huge just esteem for your own worker, right? And he goes on to say about how we have to be very careful about who we hire. They can't be intelligent. And he really created scientific management. So if you've ever worked a really shitty job where people tell you where you can put your stapler and where you can put your napkins and how you have to move, that's the basis of scientific management. And it really, going back to the theme of this session, is all about time. It's pure efficiency based. But luckily, that was 1911, guys. We have completely changed. We have evolved in such a dramatic way, because I can jump to 2013 and read you something like this, which is, we don't think for ourselves. Maybe they don't trust us to think for ourselves as human beings. I don't know. We are machines. We are robots. We plug our scanner in. We're holding it, but we might as well be plugging it into ourselves. And this was a quote from a reporter went undercover at an Amazon warehouse, and for 2 weeks was what they call a picker, and their job is to run around and grab the items that you purchased within 30 seconds. And I'm talking they cover tens of miles a day on their feet, running, collecting items, and putting them into boxes. And what I have seen more and more as being a management consultant is we've really exchanged this one idea, which is employees are animals, or employees at worst are errant children that managers have to corral. And now we've skipped into this new generation of, no. Employees are robots. They're just waiting for instructions. And altogether, it really spells what frightens me as this very mechanistic metaphor for companies, right? Going back to time again, we want to think about our companies as beautiful, perfect Swiss watches. Right? But of course we don't know that. Of course we know that that's not how organizations operate. Human beings are not robots. Human beings are not animals. An ox doesn't wake up in the morning and have a really nasty fight with their girlfriend and come to work in a really bad mood, or there's some other sort of condition happening in companies. But as managers, because managers at the same time have become so far removed from how specialized work is today, they really just want to look at their people as units of labor that they can easily engineer and control. So, jump forward to 2008. Does anyone remember that thing that happened in 2008 that sort of devastated the entire global economy? We had gotten extremely good at efficiency, guys. Like we were awesome. Thanks to McKinsey, Bain, Accenture. They really took scientific management in this great new place. But what we didn't understand, both as a global economy and individual organizations, is that adaptivity, in a world that's far more complex than it's ever been, I think you can pick a scapegoat of digital technologies. We are just so far more connected than we ever were today, and those interconnections just create massive amounts of uncertainty, and really you can't control these systems. Control is dispersed among the entire system, but we are so used to being able to look at an organization or a market and put together a beautiful Excel spreadsheet to tell us that the future will be great and we'll have graphs that go up and to the right. But in 2008, personally, I was working for some of the biggest companies in the US, CNN, GE, Pepsi, just some giant corporations. And what we really noticed is that they were so unprepared. And also personally, my father is a small business owner in Texas where I'm from. He's had a business for 40 years. He's been an entrepreneur. He's a second generation entrepreneur. He's been through busts and booms and all sorts of things that happen to the economy. And I remember the day Lehman Brothers, the biggest financial bank in America, went under, I called my dad and I was like, what do you think about this? Because consulting is a lot like construction. Like we exist on someone else's money. You have to pay us to work. And I asked him, what do you think about that? And he had been through so many booms and busts, and his very educated experience was, look, that's Wall Street. Our local banks don't play these games. And what we saw is that a speculative bubble and a single economy ricocheted across the entire world. And I mean, we are in Europe right now where we're still seeing the consequences of these actions. And they were so unforeseen and so unpredictable that I sort of went crazy, if I'm honest, because I'm an educated person. I grew up as a software engineer. I started programming when I was 6 years old. I like to see the world as a very programmable place that I can control things. And this was really difficult for me to understand. How does these sort of dramatic unintended consequences ricochet like that? And what I began to become obsessed with was the idea of complex adaptive systems. So really, we live in a world of complex adaptive systems, but most of us have never been educated. Maybe in Europe, your schools are much better, about what that really means. And a complex adaptive system just means that there are tons and tons of interconnections and interrelated lines between individual actors in a big, big system. And it means that it's unpredictable by nature. It means there is no central control telling every actor in the system how to work. And it's just like how birds flock, right? I started looking more at natural systems. So let's forget a minute for these mechanistic, time-based, how do we think of the perfect Swiss watch organization, and how do we look at organic systems? How do we look at how they function together? And I became obsessed with what is the answer there and how do they really work? And I went and spoke to people who were much, much smarter than me to really get an understanding of that. And the flock of bird analogy here I'm using is very, very intended, because one of the early questions in artificial intelligence is this right here, and this is called Boids. So this is one of the very first examples of trying to simulate artificial intelligence. And actually, the project started in the 1980s, and the question was, how do we simulate a flock of birds? And the reason why complex adaptive systems scientists do this is not to say, then how do we go control birds? What they want to understand, when you are curious about systems, what you want to understand are what are the things that influence control, not how do I control this system, because there is no top-down way to control this. So this was a project that started in the 1980s of saying, how do we model a bunch of individual birds and how do they flock together and what are really the underlying rules. That's what they were trying to discover. And at first, it was extremely complex. Like, clearly, look at this behavior. I mean, first of all, in almost any system that you see in nature, entropy tends to increase over time. And entropy is this idea of disorder. So everything that you look at, organizations, the reason why most organizations that existed in the 50s don't exist now is entropy. When you put systems together, they tend to fall apart over time. But look at this example. We actually start to see order being created over time. We see more and more order, which is really fascinating. So clearly something new is happening here. And the researchers who are working on this project, and this is literally tens of thousands of individual boids, which are birds simulated, are making their own decisions about how to behave. And you're getting this really complex behavior. And it took them years to understand what is really happening here. And the answer was counterintuitive. It was actually very, very simple. There were only 3 rules in play. 1, each boid had to have a rule that said to separate. So to steer to avoid crowding local boids and objects. Pretty simple. Don't run into shit, right? If you're a bird, that's death. Let's avoid that, starting with there. The second rule is cohesion. So this is herd mentality. Why do animals form herds? They're trying to protect themselves from predators, and they're trying to help discover food sources. So this idea of cohesion, to steer towards the average position of local boids, safety in numbers. So we have 2 rules now. Don't hit each other, but do steer towards one another. So those 2 rules together, individuals in the flock can start to decide which rule comes first and which rule follows. And the last rule is alignment. So to steer towards the average heading of local boids, understanding that at all times the system is moving. That if I steer towards where everyone was 5 minutes ago, I'm going to end up in an empty space. So I constantly have to be understanding my position in space. And really, I know this seems incredibly simple, but at the time, especially with 1980s technology, this was a eureka moment in science, and a eureka moment in a brand new science. So complex adaptive systems is a field of science, basically one of the newest. It was began in the 1980s because a bunch of biologists, economists, and physicists got together and they said, you know, a financial market works a lot like a physical environment. And also a physical environment works a lot like a human body. Maybe there are underlying rules here that govern some of these same behaviors. So this was a huge leap ahead in terms of understanding how tens of thousands of interacting agents could have their own rules. And there was no sort of master control. There's no, if you look at a flock of birds, there's not a manager flying above them telling them where to go, which I found really fascinating. And so my company, we spend all of our time thinking about how do we steer teams together and how do we think about how teams should behave with one another, because all of these things that we've been talking about the last 2 days, whether it's Internet of Things, whether it's robots, AI, is not just about where the technology is. I love technology. I grew up as I am still a huge nerd, clearly. But really, technology means nothing until humans can apply it. Until humans can use it in their work. Technology is a tool that we have to be able to choose to tinker with. And I think we are looking in a lot of ways that we are clearly in a lot of these places still in the tinkering and sketching place. So how do we empower teams inside organizations is the thing that keeps me up and a lot of other people I know. And what we've taken from boids, and not just boids, but complex adaptive systems in general, is that what you really need are local rules, right? You need a set of rules that value individual knowledge and decision making. Again, we're here about time and speed. If you're always looking for an outside management group to tell individuals what to do, that's just naturally slow, especially in a world today that is so frenetic, that we have to have local empowerment. And we have to also trust. So if I'm a bird flying around in a flock, I probably have better knowledge about what's going on right around me than someone hundreds of miles away, for an example of how most command and control companies are designed. So how do we look for local rules that value individual knowledge and decision making? The second is simple rules. So how many people here work in a company that has rules and policies? How many of you could recite them all off the top of your head right now? How the hell are you supposed to use them quickly? Like, one of our clients has a 450-page employee manual. And they pay multiple people to maintain that manual. No one else has ever read that manual. So how can you say that it actually governs behavior and guides decision making? And simple rules are, in a very basic way, if you're a computer programmer, software engineer, what you know is that you want to reduce processing time, right? If you can write 10 lines of code to accomplish the same thing as writing 1,000, you have done a really great job. So we look for a lot of ways of how we simplify rules inside companies and inside teams. And the last is shared rules. So, all of these together, I think about, if you think about how managers are trained, the first thing I'll say is like half of my job is just working with the fact that in most companies these days, there's no such thing as management training anymore. The world is swimming in shitty managers. And we are trying to solve the problem from some very strange solutions. And I think at the end of the day, if we can train managers to be more effective and to think in this way, we've done a huge service. Because think about, like, if I'm a manager and I need to reorganize my teams, or I'm like, I need to make them faster, what's the first thing I do? We need a top-down mandate. Let's get a steering committee together. Let's get a vision document set up. Let's align around a mission statement that took us probably 6 months to write and then align around. And these are not local rules. And then I have to go through this whole process of shoving it down every team's throats and ignoring their own local information and that they know what's best, likely, given their context. The second is rules tend to get really complex in companies because we as human beings like complexity for some strange reason. Like, we are really good at adding it. We are terrible at removing it. And so you end up with 500-page employee manuals. And lastly, shared rules. So this sounds great, but if anyone here has worked in a big company, which I've worked in several, you know that silos tend to spread apart over time. And no one in one silo has the same set of rules as someone else. So even trying to align people across divisions, and we tend to silo around things like discipline. So if you look at marketing, it's like, well, I'm a creative, I'm an account person, and those are very, very separated rules. So by the time we try to plug in together to get work done, we're balancing so much mental complexity. So immediately when we work with clients, we start to diagnose things like that. And then, so here's where I'm headed. And these slides are meant to be specifically unsexy design, because I think, like someone was talking about in a design session yesterday, we tend to overdrive our ego in places like this, and so many of these new models for ways of working are driven by consultants trying to sell you software and consultants trying to sell you on a panacea that says, like, this not only fixes your company, this will cure cancer. Like, when it starts to sound like that, run away. And so what I want to say is, I think that teams only need 4 rules. And I think we have been experimenting with these 4 rules, and I'd like to expose them to you now and talk a little bit about them. The first is just steer toward the unmet and emerging needs of your customer. So incredibly simple. When we do audits with teams, I say, oh, who's your customer? And if you can't answer that question, you shouldn't have a team. And that customer can be an outside customer, or it can be an internal customer. Like, we see legal departments, for example, who feel like they just don't understand that their customers are the teams that are actually trying to execute the work. And it creates a completely different relationship if I have to say, who's your customer and what do they need from you? And you should be steering obsessively about serving their needs and creating a rhythm and process and models to actually do that. Steering toward reducing internal misalignment. So in big companies with big silos, the things that you see are teams are very misaligned. So we need processes, we need ways of making decisions that share alignment. We need to steer toward becoming more autonomous as a team. So the litmus test here is that, like, can a team generate an idea, and then can they take it far enough to test or validate that idea? I don't mean to say that, do you have an idea and can you take it to commercial scale and put it out, because that's just creating a bunch of disconnected companies. What I'm saying is, can you have an idea, and do you have enough autonomy? Do you have enough roles on the team? Do you have enough disciplines that you can actually produce the work and find out if it's a good idea or a bad idea? Because that, again, comes down to speed and time. Otherwise, you're waiting to hear back from this group, and you're waiting on their roadmap, and really it doesn't allow you to move quickly to take advantages of some of the technology trends and consumer and cultural trends. And lastly, steer towards simplifying your structures and systems. I'll move so you can take photos. And and I think again, human beings are really good at adding complexity. If you've been a software engineer, you know the difference between accidental complexity and essential complexity. Essential complexity is just the rules and overhead to solve the problem. Accidental complexity is when you get in your own way. And I was a software engineer. I was a terrible one. I would write 1,000 lines of code, which would only need to be 20. That's why I stopped becoming a software engineer. So lastly, I'll say, look, customer obsession, alignment, autonomy, and simplicity. What we've begun to understand quietly over the last year and a half, we've been studying teams, closing in. Our goal is to hit 1,000 teams to understand how they maximize these things. What we've begun to understand is that teams that maximize on these four not only have double-digit engagement growth over other teams that don't have that, but they're more likely to produce profitable results for their companies. So very early stages of this. I'd love to talk a little bit more about it, but time is not our friends. If you want to learn more or if you want to get your team assessed, you can find me on Twitter there, and that's my company. Thank you.
Thank you. So everyone take